I always chuckle when I hear Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. There's something just so charmingly infantile, just so irresistibly comic when she opens her mouth. But I try not to leave it at that. I try to listen to what she's trying to say and figure out what she means. Here she's talking about how allegedly the mistreatment of indigenous peoples as well as racial injustice somehow leads to climate change. Listen.
The climate crisis is a crisis born of injustice, and it is a crisis born of the pursuit of profit at any and all human and ecological cost. That's right. Which means that we must recognize in legislation that the trampling of indigenous rights is a cause of climate change. The trampling of racial justice is a cause of climate change.
Wow. So let's try to figure this out. How can it be that, let's just say, the mistreatment of indigenous peoples, let's say the ignoring of their demands or the setting aside of a treaty, does that actually cause hurricanes? Does the earth get really angry and decide we're going to lash out by sending a tsunami? Does the average temperature rise because the earth has a fever? Or let's consider racial injustice. Let's consider what Derek Chauvin did to George Floyd. Does that promote climate change? Was somehow that action making the earth groan? Was it making the oceans rise? The coastal cities get flooded? This makes no sense. The only way to understand what AOC is saying is to look at it historically. That somehow you might say the injustices of slavery, the greedy conquest of the continent, as she might put it, all of this somehow caused, and continues to cause, climate change. Now, slavery, in a way, was far from being industrial development. It represented the opposite of development. In fact, the slaves were made to do things in the South that the machines would do in the North. So who was putting the carbon into the atmosphere? Obviously, it was the machines. It was the Industrial Revolution in the North, not the agricultural slave society of the South, that was putting carbon into the atmosphere. So it's hard to see how slavery promoted climate change. It would seem that as an institution, it perhaps retarded climate change. Now, turning to the occupation of the Americas, I will concede that the American Indians living, you may say, in primitive simplicity, were not doing any harm to the climate, perhaps, but is that the world that AOC wants to live in? The American Indians, in a sense, were living in almost caveman conditions. Some of the tribes never even had the wheel. There was no development. And so here's AOC, and she's in her apartment, and she's cooking gourmet food, and she's a bartender, and she's traveling around by jets, and so on. So she's taking advantage of all the accoutrements of civilization, apparently accoutrements that she's not willing to give up, while deploring the greed and selfishness that made that lifestyle possible. Now, if AOC wants to repudiate all that, you can do that. You can go AOC to the Amazon. You can climb into a tree. You can live like the indigenous people there. You'll probably have a life expectancy of 5 more years. You'll be vulnerable to all kinds of lethal diseases. But maybe the earth will be grateful. Maybe the earth will send you a thank you note for leaving the United States. And hey, so will I.